welcome once again to Think 304 Managerial Economies. This is session 6, and in this session we'll be dealing with cost and revenue. Remember what we did in session 5? We tried to understand production, and the reason why we tried to understand production, or we tried to look at the relationship between output and input, was because production was going to be a very important topic for cost and revenue. Once we've understood production, we are now in a better position to understand cost and revenue. So in this session, we're going to be looking at how cost would vary with output or production, and how revenue would also vary with output or production. We are still on our way to understanding profit, remember. That's our ultimate aim. But in this session, we are going to be looking at the relationship between cost and output, and then revenue and output. So the key topics to be covered in here are cost in the short run and cost in the long run. Then we'll look at revenue of price takers and revenue of price makers, how they all vary with output. And then we'll go on to look at the cost structure for firms producing multiple products. Remember our basic text, buy and prints, Managerial Economics, and Business Strategy, the 8th edition. So what are the different measures of cost that we need to take into account? We have what we call fixed cost. Obviously, in the short run, we said that we have fixed inputs and variable inputs. And those inputs would come with cost because we would need to buy them. So the cost of a fixed input, in the example that we gave before, the fixed inputs was, let's say, a building or the machine. So the cost of that would give us the fixed cost. And the cost of the variable inputs is what is going to give us the variable cost. So the cost of labor and the cost of the water, as we saw in the previous slide, will give us the variable cost. A combination of the fixed cost and the variable cost obviously would give us what we call total cost. It's important for us to know what sunk cost is. Sunk cost is a cost that cannot be recouped, and because we can never recoup the sunk cost, it's going to be lost forever, and therefore we are talking about profit. The sunk cost is really not important for us to consider. So let's start with cost in the short run, because remember we had production in the short run and production in the long run. We're going to be looking at cost in the short run. Cost in the short run would mean that in the short run we're going to be having both variable cost and fixed cost. So the total cost obviously is going to be the variable cost and the fixed cost. The variable cost here will be a cost that would not vary, that would vary with output, and the fixed cost would be a cost that would not vary with output. So in terms of the relationship between variable cost and output, we're going to be seeing our variable cost increasing as output is increasing, because as we increase output, we'll be employing more of the variable input, and for which reason our variable cost would also be going up. And then our fixed cost would be a cost that obviously will not vary with with output, because our fixed inputs doesn't vary with output. So if we're looking at how the diagrams will look like, we have our cost measures on the y-axis, and then our output measures on the x-axis. We see that our variable cost is increasing as output is increasing, because to increase output we would need to employ more variable inputs. And then we see that our fixed cost is the same irrespective of what output we produce, because obviously it's an input that fixed inputs are inputs that would not change as our output is changing. So you see that the line is very straight and it's horizontal. Because total cost is a combination of variable cost and fixed cost, we see that our total cost is increasing as our output is increasing, coming from the variable cost element. And obviously it's not starting from the origin because of the fixed cost component. We have other measures of cost like the average total cost and the average variable cost and the marginal cost. And you can see here that they are U-shaped. And obviously, they are the opposite of the marginal products and the average products. Why are they U-shaped? They are U-shaped because of the law of diminishing returns. Now, what does the law of diminishing returns tell us? It tells us that as we start increasing our variable input, we would find our marginal product initially increasing and then eventually diminishing. We can apply that same principle over here. What can we say? We can say that initially as we employ our variable input, we find that our marginal product is increasing at an increasing rate. So we find our marginal product increasing. But remember, how much variable input we would have employed would be very, very little. And so the cost of that additional variable input will be reducing, will be small. It's going to be small because marginal cost is given by the change in total cost over the change in output. So how much our total cost will be changing by initially would be very, very small compared to how much our output would be increasing by, and therefore would initially find our marginal cost reducing. However, as we increase more of our variable input, then what's going to be happening is that we will find our output decreasing, and it's going to be decreasing at a faster rate compared to the cost that we are going to be at a slower rate, compared to the cost that our output, is going to be increasing at a slower pace. So we'll find that our output is going to be increasing at a much slower rate compared to that of how much our total cost would be increasing by. Our total cost would increase at a faster rate. Given that our marginal cost is change in total cost over change in output, we find the ratio increasing. And so we find that our marginal cost will be increasing faster as we employ more and more and more of our output. We've already established a relationship between marginals and averages. So we can bring that same principle here. Whenever the marginal is below the average should be falling. And when the marginal gets above the average should be rising, which means that in this case, the marginal will cut the average from below and is going to be cutting it at its minimum. Now, when we turn to the long run, we are going to be seeing a different picture. In the long run, remember, we don't have a fixed input, and therefore we don't have a fixed cost. We do have only variable costs. And so our interest is not in the marginals, etc. Our interest would just lie in the averages. We see that the average cost would also be U-shaped, which means that in the long run, we are going to be having a U-shaped average cost curve, even though both inputs are variable. Now, why is it U-shaped? It's U-shaped because of certain concepts, economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. Economies of scale will tell us that as we employ more of our inputs, we'll find our average cost declining. So as output increases initially, we'll find our average cost declining, and then our average cost would increase as we increase more of our output. Why do we experience economies of scale? When we are increasing our output, we can, for instance, have division of labor and specialization because we are employing more inputs, and we can assign them to different tasks, and we'll find that our average cost can decrease as a result of that. We can also be able to do bulk purchases, and we can find that our average cost would decrease. And you can think of many other reasons that would make our average cost go down. However, as we get bigger and bigger as a firm, we'll find that our average cost would be increasing. Why should our average cost be increasing as we even get bigger? Now, management will become a problem as we get bigger. There could also be disruption of production process because if one person is not in, because of division of labor and specialization, the other people cannot do the task assigned to that person. And so you find that production process is going to be disrupted. And you can still think of the many more reasons why our average cost would go down. Now, if we consider So all up until now, what we've been doing is that we've been looking at a firm that is producing a single product. But we can have situations where we have firms that produce multiple products, and we would want to know, under that circumstance, how output would vary with cost measures. This leads us to what we call cost complementarity and economies of scope. Now, starting with economies of scope, what do we mean by economies of scope? Economies of scope will tell us how, if we're producing two products together, how that the cost of that will be separate or will be different from if we're producing the products separately in different factories. So I give you an example. If Unilever decides to produce, let's say, soap and toothpaste, and they decide to produce it together or at one premise, then their costs can be different from if they were producing it in different factories. Because remember, they could share labor, they could share some inputs. And so it's possible for Unilever producing these two products jointly to have its costs being lower than its total cost being lower than that of the situation if it was producing these products separately. When the cost of producing the products jointly is lower than the cost of producing them individually, then we say that the firm is enjoying economies of scope. So you see here that if you have a cost of producing product 1 separately and the cost of producing product 2 separately, you add them, being bigger than the cost of producing them together, then we say that the firm is enjoying economies of scope. Now we have another concept which we call cost complementarity. Now a firm enjoys cost complementarity if the marginal cost of producing good 1 declines as we increase the production of good 2, or vice versa. So you see here that if the change in the marginal cost of producing good 1 as a result of producing good 2 is negative, then we say that the firm is enjoying cost complementarity. Or if the change in the marginal cost of producing good 2 as a result of producing more of good 1 is less than 0 or is negative, then we say that the firm is enjoying cost complementarity. So we have an example here, and we want to know whether the firm is enjoying cost complementarity and enjoying economies of scope. You can use that in your example. Having dealt with cost and having understood production in the previous session, we are also now in a better position to understand revenue. Now, it's important for us to understand that different industries would behave in different ways as far as revenues are concerned. We cannot compare how revenue will vary with output of a car industry to how revenue would vary with output in, let's say, a food industry. These are two different industries that are structured differently. A food industry may have many sellers. It may have many sellers that are very small. A car industry may have very few industries. Very few firms that are very, very large. So if we're dealing with revenue and looking at how revenue will vary with output, it's very, very important that we look at these industries differently. So we can segregate industries into two main parts: industries that are price makers and industries that are price takers. If we took the food industry as an example, because the food industry would have many sellers, it would have, each firm in there would have very little influence on the price in that industry. So they will take the price as given, and in that case we can call them price takers. However, if we're thinking about the car industry, they'll be price makers because they would have a say, or they could have a say as to what the price would be like. So showing you this table, if we have the price taker, then they'll be taking the price as given, and the price would not change unless changed by the industry. So if we assume that the price is 5 and it's going to be 5 throughout, for each level of output that is being produced and being sold is going to be 5. The price is going to be 5. So I have quantities 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and for each of them we are going to be having the price remaining at 5. Total revenue is what is given to you over there, and the average revenue you can calculate. That would be the total revenue divided by the output, and the marginal revenue obviously would be the change in total revenue divided by the change in output sold. For price makers, they have influence over the price. However, if they want to change how much they are selling or increase how much they are selling, they need to be able to reduce their price. Remember what the law of demand says. So you find that as they want to sell more, they have to be reducing their price. And therefore, their total revenue would be increasing up to a certain point, and then it will start declining. The average revenue you can see over here would be declining, and the marginal revenue obviously would also be declining. Now let's look at certain observations that we've made as far as the different the price makers and the price takers are concerned. How do their revenues vary with output? You'll see from that table here that we've shown that for price takers, the average revenue is the same as the marginal revenue, and that's equal to the price. And remember, the price curve is always equal to the demand curve. Average revenue also would always be equal to the price. So these are horizontal, and therefore they would not vary as output is varying, or they do not vary with output. The price makers their revenues behave differently. Now you find that the average revenue, which is equal to the demand curve and which is also equal to the price, would be decreasing as output is increasing. However, those measures would not be the same as the price. You'd see from the table that those measures are greater than the marginal revenue, even though the marginal revenue would also be decreasing as the price is decreasing. And the reason is that for them to be able to sell more, they need to be able to reduce their prices, and therefore how much they'll be adding on to their total revenue would always be smaller than the price. So we are heading towards the concept of profit maximization. Having looked at cost and having looked at revenue, we can now talk a bit about profit maximization. The condition for profit maximization will be marginal cost being equal to marginal revenue. Why? And then we should find our marginal cost rising afterwards. Why is this so? If marginal cost was bigger than marginal revenue, as a rational producer, what would you do? You will stop production, and so you would have reached the profit maximizing point, and then it wouldn't serve you well if you went on to produce. If marginal cost was less than the marginal revenue as a producer, what would you do? It would mean that you'd be adding more to revenue than cost, and rationally you would want to be producing more, which means that you would not have achieved your profit maximizing point. And so the only point where you would have achieved your profit maximizing point is when your marginal cost is just equal to your marginal revenue. So as a producer, you would always be comparing your marginal cost to your marginal revenue. Where your marginal cost is equal to your marginal revenue is where you'll be maximizing profit. Thank you for your attention, and see you in the next session.